This is an issue that we all look at, and one cannot escape the conclusion that with the trends that we are now seeing in progress, that is to say, greater advancement in the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Initially, much of the attention now is focused on the Iranian program, about which we could talk later. But should Iran become nuclear, inevitably this would spill over into neighboring countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey. So we may see an avalanche of proliferation into the Middle East. This is a very disturbing prospect. Now, we are seeing the building up of arsenals in North Korea, in Pakistan, even in India, and that is also a trend in the negative direction. Finally, not only we see the quantitative geographical proliferation, but we are seeing the persistence of disputes and conflicts among and between nuclear powers or potential nuclear powers. So if you combine these two elements, the multiplicity of regional conflicts among potential or existing nuclear powers, plus the quantitative growth and spread of nuclear weapons, the incidence of an outbreak of war, accidental or not accidental, is increasing. And that is a very ominous problem. Well, you see, it is true that at the moment we have a friction, let's say a conflict which appears to be growing in intensity between Iran and Israel. But this is not confined only to Iran and Israel. On the so-called Israeli side, you find partners of ours in our concern from the Iranian expansionist policy and sometimes provocative policies in the Middle East. So we have a number of Muslim, Sunni, Arab countries that are equally concerned with the Iranian policies and form, in a way, either an informal alliance or a bloc. So there is this, and on the Iranian side, you may find as their own proxies and allies in this conflict, on their side, you find the Lebanese Hezbollah, you may find the Syrian regime, you may find other local militias in the Persian Gulf or in the Arabian Peninsula. So it is not just a two-state confrontation, but let's say between two blocs. That conflict could indeed escalate. It's a problem. But the escalation may not occur necessarily along the lines of this conflict. You have other conflicts in the region which are equally explosive. And you can see that in the form of the radical extremist Islamic forces operating in Iraq, elsewhere. And each one of these conflicts could also erupt with great violence, including what was the most devastating incidents of violence in the Middle East in the last few years, which was the Syrian civil war. So it is not the Israeli-Iranian conflict that dominates the possibility of conflict escalating in the Middle East. There are unfortunately others as well. This is perhaps the most acute, the most critical strategic question on the regional and global agenda at the moment. At the center of this question, we find the effort by the new administration in Washington, plus others, which have been parties to the JCPOA, trying to come to a new agreement with Iran, seeking to restrain Iran from moving forward as it had in the last couple of years, ever closer to the nuclear option. Now, we are at the very critical stage of these negotiations. It is the Iranians who have been slowing down. The Iranians have made a great advancement in the last few months, and they are now much closer than ever before to having sufficient quantities within a few weeks to build a first device, nuclear device, which is more advanced than ever before. They can continue that because there are no restrictions on them. And now we are seeing those delicate and tense negotiations, whether they will come to an agreement or not. One doesn't know. It is very much a bargaining game because the Iranians have their own objectives. They would like to maintain the nuclear option, but at the same time, they would like to lessen the economic price that they are paying by having sanctions on them and so forth. So it is a tough bargaining situation. I fear that that we may come to one of two possible bad outcomes. One bad outcome is that there would be no agreement, and therefore Iran would feel free to move closer and closer to the nuclear threshold, which will compel some action, some preventive action, possibly by Israel or by others, because the American administration has publicly declared that Iran would not become nuclear, and this is an objective that remains on the table. A negative outcome is that there would be no agreement, and therefore there would be a race on the part of those who are trying to limit, as against Iran, which is trying to get closer. But even if there is an agreement, which would be welcome because it would have some restraining elements in curtailing the Iranian advancement, in regimenting it, and in slowing it down in an agreed way, that would still be such that it is already too late in so many ways, and Iran is already far advanced. The likelihood of rolling back Iran, the way the agreement in 2015 attempted to do by taking away certain inventories, certain machines, such as advanced centrifuges, the likelihood of having such measures come into play is not very high. Still, if there is a determined front by those who are trying to prevent Iran from moving forward, including on the part of the other partners of the JCPOA, then there may be chance of having an agreement which is better than none, but still much too advanced for us not to be concerned about a possible breakout and create still an atmosphere of high instability. Well, the military measure is there, and Israel has declared more than once that a nuclear Iran led by this extremely militant and hostile regime as it has is simply unacceptable to Israel, making it impossible, making it also very dangerous, and therefore Israel was not shy away from using as a last resort a military option that would have the ability of curtailing or terminating the Iranian program. But this does not exhaust the range of other means Some already are in play, and some could be used. Those already in play, as you can see, are covert activities that have the effect of disrupting the Iranian program, activities that limit their ability to move ahead, certain things that prolong certain activities and in so doing gain time. There are many such options which are of limited scale. Often they are not attributed necessarily to Israel, and they may be undertaken by other interested parties, not the least of which you have the United States and its allies. But then we have also other measures which could act as incentives. There is room for diplomacy and constructive diplomacy there by providing inducement, not only sanctions for violations, but also inducement for good behavior. And that card can be played. It has been played in the past, and it can get results because the economic factor, the energy factor, are factors that weigh heavily in the Iranian calculus, and they can play a role also in achieving a slowing down or a delaying of the program. So there is a rich menu of such options, all of which should be employed, and some should be employed imaginatively by all allies, so that one could get the desired result of preventing Iran from coming even close to having a military nuclear option. This is another dimension of the problem, which is the Iranian activities in the region, either in high seas or along in the Arabian Peninsula and elsewhere, where they use their proxies or their own forces to gain a stronger foothold and to expand the Iranian influence. Now, all these activities all over the Middle East have resulted here and there in some kind of limited exchanges, be it with Saudi Arabia, with the United States, or with Israel. And the tankers, since so much of this business is a maritime naval activity, the tankers have also become a victim of some attacks by both parties, tankers or other cargo vessels. Now, by and large, I would hope that these two would be curtailed. Of course, there is an international demand leveled at Iran to stop its activities, its expansionist and military activities elsewhere, and to stop its support of violent elements in the region. But at the same time, I think it is in the interest of all concerned to prevent any escalation of such limited encounters. The situation is risky as it is, and the order of the day should not be to try to engage in escalation or to score points in a kind of a war of attrition, because it is never a decisive element, never, and it becomes a habit which could get out of hand if this tit for tat game is pursued. So I think that just as I would hope for constructive diplomacy to limit the Iranian nuclear activity in progress, I would also hope for some kind of a political atmosphere that would limit those exchanges anywhere they occur, on the high seas or in other parts of the Middle East. This also calls for international cooperation, and I think there is room for activity there as well. This is a key question that one should try to address seriously and not in a politically motivated fashion. And all of us observers of the Iranian conduct are trying to really make up our mind, what are they aiming at? I think the overall impression that we have is that at the end of the day, the Iranian regimes do want to have military nuclear capability. This has been a kind of a long-term objective, and it comes from a number of origins which have to do with Iran concept of itself as a country that has been attacked a number of times from the outside by its neighbors from the north to the west, and that is surrounded by by nuclear weapons, be it Pakistan, China, Iraq was on the road to that, and Russia, of course. And because it has an image of itself as a potential victim of hostilities and its own greatness as an old established civilization. So this is a goal that they would like to pursue, but it is not set in stone, and it is not necessarily defined as urgent. It can become urgent if they come to the conclusion that without having nuclear weapons as a deterrent, they may face another type of foreign attack of the kind that Iraq had sustained in the first and second Gulf Wars, or by others. If they feel that an attack on Iran is imminent when they have no weapons, this may increase the urgency with which they would like to have that weapon, because they would believe, wrongly, I think, that once they have the weapon, the world will reconcile itself to that reality on the one hand, and would be deterred from taking any action against Iran if it is necessary. But at the moment, they are balancing their activities on this with having a timetable which is flexible. They had a program at one time which had a definite timetable in which they said, by so many years from now, we would like to have an arsenal of at least 5 nuclear warheads. And that was a program that indicated what the ultimate objective was, how much, and when. Do they have such a program now? One doesn't know. The situation can be dynamic, but they are trying to, in a way, calculate their advancement, taking into account other considerations. One is, yes, possibly to have nuclear weapons, but not at the expense of risking a war on themselves, either a preventive or preemptive war on themselves, or any type of war. Because if the rush to have nuclear weapons will trigger a preventive war on them, then that's too high a risk. On the one hand, they'll pay dearly by that attack, and secondly, it would foil their effort to have nuclear weapons. Secondly, they would like to do it on the cheap. They do not want to pay economically such high a price as sustaining the economic sanctions, having seen their exports of oil or gas being curtailed. They want to advance their economic interest at the same time. So when you factor into their calculations such calculations as not risking a war on themselves as a preventive type, or trying to improve their condition economically, there you have the flexibility along which they can delay the moment in which they actually cross the threshold into being nuclear. And that's why there is no inevitability to it. And over the long run, who knows? Well, this is indeed the fear. The fear is, and it is not an imagined fear, that if Iran becomes nuclear, the chances that Saudi Arabia, for its own reasons, Egypt, for its own reasons as well, and even Turkey may follow suit and also become nuclear in one capacity or another. The Saudis, maybe to deter Iran, also for their own self-defense. They also have a relationship with Pakistan, which has become a very, very well-armed nuclear power itself. So Saudi Arabia could become nuclear. Why should Egypt? Well, Egypt also regards itself as a major regional power. Egypt has taken a decision in the past not to develop weapons, but it could revisit that question if and when it would see that its neighbors are pursuing such weapons. And finally, we have Turkey, which is also a formidable military entity. And depending on the orientation of the regime there, it may also visit that option. It's not beyond its means. So there are many variations of this trend, whether it would occur simultaneously or one would feed on the other. But the fear is that unless Iran is blocked from becoming nuclear, then the gates would be thrown open into other powers in the Middle East. Now, as for Israel, Israel's declared policy has always been that it will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. But implied in that statement was that should there be other nuclear weapons in the area, Israel too would follow suit. So the possibility of Israel coming and declaring its own deterrent once Iran becomes nuclear is very high as well. So we have a Middle East which may see multiple centers of power becoming nuclear, and that's a nightmare. That is one of the main reasons why the Iranian program should be halted at this phase, if not rolled back, for the sake of future stability. And I think that much effort should go in that direction. Needless to say, if Ukraine goes back to being a nuclear power, it would not be a healthy situation at all. And it should be avoided. And it should be avoided with all means possible, short of a preventive war. But it would not be welcome at all. Russia has its own abilities, but the United States should also exercise maximum persuasive capabilities to prevent that from happening. But this is, again, a diplomatic issue. In the very long run, I believe that it may come a point in which nuclear weapons would become obsolete, would become less useful, rightly or wrongly, because they would turn out into being very heavy, very cumbersome, very expensive, a means of mass destruction, whereas the development of science and cyber offers the place for having weapons which are no less destructive, but not nuclear. So that is why, for the very long term, I'm not necessarily pessimistic about the possibility that nuclear weapons would be gradually discarded, not because the world has become more peaceful, but because they would be replaced by new technologies. So this is optimistic pessimism or pessimistic optimism. In the very long term, I think it is and should be practiced. And it is in the NPT and so forth. To disarm the world of nuclear weapons is a thought which is thought for the very long term, among other reasons, because in the short term, weapons do still serve also a defensive deterrent role. But in the very long term, it may come to it that nuclear weapons would be simply replaced, unfortunately, as I said, by other means, and that the process of ridding the world of nuclear weapons would take place. Israel's long-term goal is to see a world which is free of all weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear. I think that much of the world leadership is preoccupied with other crises at a time when the nuclear prospects also deserve attention, and with the kind of the leaders of the world in the framework in which they gather, they could and should engage more intensively some of these problems so as to improve what goes on today in the limitation and in the reduction of nuclear arsenals. And some of this could be the product, the helpful, fruitful product of a greater energy and greater leadership practiced by the leaders of the world. Let's call them the 9, the 5, the 3, whatever you call them. More attention could result in better results.